Hey everyone, welcome back to a new video. Today we're doing creepy holiday stories. Joining me in this video is my great friend, Swamp Dweller. If you enjoy his narration, definitely check out his channel and subscribe. Happy holidays everyone. Now, let's begin on the stories. There's a lot that happens within our family before this event, so let me explain. My mom's brother, who for the sake of this story I'll call Clark, has been married to this woman for over 20 years now, and they have one child together. Growing up, I've always been told that my aunt was a little off, and I was instructed by my mother to stay clear of her if I ever had the chance. She seemed pretty normal to me until I was around 10 years old, and she started harassing my mother and my grandparents. She would hit on my grandfather and show up to their house unannounced and would occasionally try to start fights with them. We had to block her on all of our phones, and my uncle was told that she's no longer allowed on ours or our grandparents' property. Years had gone by without much issue towards us, but for the past few years, she has been mentally abusing my uncle along with my cousin, and once in a fit of rage, she actually peed on the floor in front of my cousin. Yes, full-on squatted and relieved herself. My cousin has since moved out. With all the background information out of the way, let's get to the actual story. It was Christmas Eve about a year ago. And as for tradition, we were having dinner at my grandparents' house. It was my grandparents, mom, dad, brother, uncle, cousin, and their dog Holly. We're at the dinner table, which is in view of the front porch windows, when we hear the doorbell ring furiously and the door being pounded on. As we looked over at the windows, who do we see? Her. My uncle gets up and goes outside to talk to her. From the table, we can hear a bit of yelling and my uncle opens the door to come back in when all of a sudden she grabs the dog and then threatens to take it away if my uncle didn't give her the money that she wanted. At this point, my parents are outside watching all of this along with a few neighbors. My uncle gets in the car with her, and before she gets in to drive, she then yells, "What the hell are you looking at? I know I'm beautiful, and God loves me." Then she gets in the car and speeds off. So we're all at the windows just stunned and absolutely confused, all the while my cousin is texting his father to make sure he's okay. He lets us know that he is and that he was going to an ATM to get her some money so that they would leave her alone. About an hour or so later, my uncle gets back with the dog and tells us that she was basically holding him hostage because he didn't give her enough money. But finally, with a bit of bribing, she brought him back, and I haven't seen her since. The rest of the night obviously had a lot of tension, and I watched the road behind us all the way home, scared that she was following us. Since the incident, things have escalated at their house. We have found out that she's doing drugs and has been cheating on my uncle for a while now. For those asking why we didn't call the cops, he told us not to. I don't really know why, but he hasn't really done much about her, except tell her that he wants a divorce, but nothing's come of that. So, to my really crazy aunt who's pretty much threatened my entire family, please, let's not ever, ever meet again. I attended what was expected to be a super fun party ringing in 2015 at a close friend's home. I expected to be awake until dawn, so I made sure to eat a really big dinner and arrived late to the party around 11 p.m. with two of my best friends. We were a pretty tight-knit social group, and despite the party being a combination house show with several bands playing, I knew virtually all of the 60 or so people who were already there when I arrived. Among friends and acquaintances, everyone was celebrating, drinking, and generally having a really great time. I had planned to meet up with some other friends at around 2 a.m. when they were done bartending a public event, so I was drinking socially but in moderation. I'm no stranger to the sauce, and I have a healthy tolerance. By midnight, the party had grown to at least 100 people, and by this time there were people drifting in from neighboring parties and the surrounding university area, despite attempts to limit attendees to people we actually knew. I opened my third beer at around 1 a.m. and continued taking photos, snaps, and messaging other friends who were not there. Around 1:30 a.m., I started to feel really drunk and thinking that perhaps I was just overwhelmed by the constant activity all around me. I stepped into the mostly empty living room for a breather and to message my friend. I sent her a message inviting her to the party as we had planned on meeting up. As I finished my message, I felt someone come up behind me. He then pressed his body against me as he gripped my hip. As I straightened up, I could feel him bending down slightly to whisper into my ear. But it wasn't a whisper. He then clearly said to me,
"In a few minutes, you aren't going to remember a single thing. And then, I'm going to rape the hell out of you."
I froze. It hit me. I wasn't feeling really drunk. The confusion I had attributed to social anxiety or the large crowd, I was experiencing because I had been drugged. I knew I had only moments to prevent the inevitable. I ran from him best I could and didn't turn around. I went and retrieved my purse and jacket and started calling the two people that I meant to meet up with at 2 a.m. I was so out of it that I was having a hard time communicating what was happening. I started crying and moving throughout the house, trying to find someone that I could explain it to. I was way too disoriented. Thankfully, friend number 1 was able to leave from bartending early and came to get me. He called me as I ran outside, and the creepy guy literally chased me. I got to my friend's car, and as I started to black out, he said the creepy guy was trying to wave him down, shouting to him that he was my friend and was going to take me home. Friend number 1 told me that I just kept saying, "Drive, drive," over and over again. And he took me home where we met up with friend number 2, who was bartending the event. At 2:30 a.m., I lost consciousness and remained unconscious for 5.5 hours. They were shaking me, trying to get some kind of reaction. Nothing. I didn't respond in any way. They sat up with me throughout the night to make sure I was okay. Around 7 a.m., I somehow managed to get up and climb into my bed. At 9 a.m., I awoke and I had no idea where I was. I was so relieved to discover that I was safely at home. I think I was high for a total of 20 hours, and I didn't really feel normal again for several days. I don't think I'll ever know who drugged me, and I only have a vague description to work from. I'm really fortunate and very grateful to have my friends. Be careful out there. When I was 13, the dawning of a new millennium took place on New Year's Eve. While people were fearing for the worst with the Y2K bug or out partying and drinking, I was home alone. In 1996, my parents had split up, and from there they divorced, and my mother and I moved across the country from Oregon to Tennessee with her best friend. On the eve of the year 2000, I was home alone and my mother was currently out of state. Now, this really didn't worry me as this wasn't the first time. I often came home to find a note on the kitchen counter saying that they had gone to Florida for a few days and that there were groceries in the fridge. Since the divorce, she was regularly leaving me alone for really long periods of time to go to Florida. We lived on a relatively quiet road surrounded by trees and set a few miles out of town. And I knew most of the people, if not by name, then by face, enough to wave and small chat with, and had never before been given a reason to be afraid of being alone. On the night in question, I was staying up late watching television. I had most of the lights on in the house. Not because I was afraid, but because at 13 I wasn't really concerned with the electricity bills or saving the environment. I felt completely safe and protected within my little bubble of home. As I was watching the movie, I kept hearing these weird noises outside, but I remember thinking it was probably just the neighbors. Though they weren't extremely close, a couple of them were having a party / had people over for the holiday. About halfway into the movie, however, the power in the house suddenly went dead. I sat on the couch for a minute, just sort of in a panic daze, because it was near midnight and pitch black. I remember thinking that the power must have gone out and that it would just come back on, so I just decided to sit on the couch with my blanket and just wait. A few minutes passed by when I heard a noise in the kitchen, where the back door is. My heart started racing in my chest because I thought it sounded like the back door being shut. The back door sits just off in the dining room, which is connected to the kitchen, which leads directly into the living room, where I was currently sitting on the couch. A few seconds passed after I had heard the sound, and I was straining my ears to pick up anything that wasn't supposed to be there. Every noise suddenly felt magnified. When footsteps sounded on the floor, I immediately slithered off the couch onto all fours, crawled around the ottoman, and started as slowly and as quietly as I could make my way toward the space between the love seat and the couch. I knew I could fit under the side table and be completely hidden by the dark and the ottoman from playing hide-and-go-seek in the dark many times with my friends during sleepovers. I was nearly there when the footsteps became more apparent. I knew from the sound of them that whoever it was making their way through the kitchen, now toward the living room where I was. They weren't hurried or anything. It was like they were just moving around in the kitchen. I then glanced up from where I was crouched on the floor, and to my horror, there was a dark silhouette standing in the archway between the two rooms. To my credit, I didn't scream. However, I did panic. I stood immediately to my feet from my hiding spot and ran down the hallway. And I believe the only reason I wasn't overcome was because the person chasing me had to get around the ottoman in the dark to follow me. I did what all children do when they're afraid, and I bypassed the front door, the guest room, the bathroom, and ran to the farthest door down the hallway. My room. In all honesty, I probably wouldn't have been able to get the front door unlocked and open in time, as it was right off to the side of the couch. When I was 10, I got a bird for my birthday. He was a blue-fronted Amazon, and I named him Boo because it was October and close to Halloween. Boo had a large iron cage. It was kept in my room. This information will become relevant later in the story. As I ran into the room, I slammed the door shut and then locked it. However, the lock was simply one of those little turn knobs that you can easily pop with a butter knife. I had barely gotten the door shut and locked when the person on the other side knocked on it. I have no idea why they knocked. If they did it to mock me or to scare me, but I knew in my heart that my little lock was not going to keep whoever it was on the other side out of my room. It didn't keep my mother out when we were arguing, and it wouldn't stand up to brute force. I was panicking, on the verge of tears, when the person started laughing. It was low, quiet. It wasn't like manic laughter, but as if they were genuinely amused. It was the laughter that really frightened me, and I started heavily, hysterically crying and looking around my room trying to figure out what the hell I could do. That was when I realized Boo's cage would fit almost perfectly between the door and the wall of my closet. The cage moved quietly on my carpeted floor, but as I pushed it into place, it scraped against the door and alerted whoever it was on the other side that I was trying to barricade myself in. Because suddenly they then threw themselves at my door, and you could hear the sound of the wood splintering and the door handle being twisted so violently. Boo, who had been stirred by the movement awake, began literally screaming and flapping his wings. I might have even screamed with him, but honestly, I don't really remember screaming. I just remember being extremely terrified. Terrified I crawled under my bed and waited. Several minutes passed, and the person eventually stopped attacking my door. Boo continued screaming even after he had stopped. Though being under my bed gave me no feeling of being secure, I didn't come out from under it because I simply had nowhere else to go. I thought about trying to go out the window, but I was afraid he might expect it and therefore be waiting for me on the other side, and it was also several feet off the ground, as the house was built on a raised foundation. I remember laying under my bed, just terrified, for what felt like hours. I must have fallen asleep because I awoke in the next morning to daylight. The fear of what happened came back to me as soon as I registered where I was and why, and scared that whoever had been in my house might still be there. I then decided to crawl out the window and run to a neighbor since it was daylight outside, and therefore I felt less afraid. Crawling out a window is a lot harder than it looks, and I did it less than gracefully, as I was not and still am not the most coordinated human being. Once I was back on my feet, however, I carefully made my way around the house, and that's when I noticed the back door was wide open. Still pretty scared, but feeling braver now that I was outside and that it was morning instead of pitch black night, I walked up the back steps and peered inside. Seeing nothing out of the ordinary, I decided to go back inside. Looking back now, I really cringe on how stupid this could have turned out, and I really wish that I could have told my younger self to make the smarter move and just go get help. But thankfully, no one was inside the house. I did a terrifying, heart-pounding room-to-room check, looking in closets and under the beds, even behind the couch, anywhere that I thought even a small child might be able to fit. I even popped the lock on my mom's bedroom so that I could check it, and then relocked it afterwards. When I was absolutely positive there was no one there, I then went back to lock the back door and noticed that the breaker box on the opposite wall was also open. The main switch had been pulled. I flipped it back on, locked both locks on the back door, checked all the windows and front door, and then called my mom, where I once again broke down crying hysterically. She called a coworker who came and stayed the entire day with me as they drove back. My mom still took random trips to Florida after that, but I always went with her from then on forward. So terrifying, laughing, crazy person that broke into my house on New Year's Eve. Please, don't ever come back. I sincerely hope no other young girl had to meet you either. I don't really know if you were just some drunk visitor of a neighbor, but you terrorized me that night. I was really afraid of being alone when my mom was working, and to this day, I still get scared when I am home alone. I overthink what I would do if someone came inside and where I would hide. Whenever my cats make a noise out of nowhere, I immediately investigate for fear it's someone trying to get in. I'm really glad I survived that night. I was 5 years old, and my mom was going into labor with my younger brother. I stayed at my grandparents' while my folks were at the hospital. I shared the queen bed with my grandfather, who was sound asleep, snoring. At some point late in the night, I was awoken by the bed shaking quite vigorously. It continued for like 5 minutes, but who really knows, maybe it was just 30 seconds. I tried to shake my grandfather awake while calling for him to wake up. He eventually woke up very groggily, but he had no clue when I asked him what was happening. He quickly fell back to sleep, but I was very frightened and still awake. I was now sat up in the bed, sitting in diffused moonlight. All was still and silent. I got up, wanting to look at the Christmas tree. Christmas trees always brought me comfort, and that's what I craved after such a fright. From the foot of the bed, you could look out of the room through the short hallway and into the front room and picture window, maybe 25 or 30 feet away. They had a mid-century aluminum Christmas tree in front of that window. Not because retro is cool, but it was literally the same tree that they used since the 50s. As I looked out to that tree without lights at 3 a.m., the tree, along with some presents, sat quietly. Only filtered bluish streetlight gently filled the room with weak illumination. However, there was something that was different now. Sitting next to the aluminum tree was a pair of 2 huge black Doberman pinschers, sitting silent and still, just staring straight at me. Well, my grandparents didn't have any pets. I jumped back into bed and threw the covers right over me. I eventually fell asleep and woke up to the morning sunshine making the aluminum tree warmly shimmer. I think about what happened that night from time to time. It's the first paranormal encounter I've ever had. At that point in my life, I don't think I even had a concept of ghosts or the paranormal. Was it really just simply a 5-year-old with limited understanding of the world and an unlimited imagination? Or was there something paranormal shaking that bed and presenting those enormous dogs? I guess I'll never know, but I will always wonder. So this happened in the 90s in Miami during the Christmas holiday break when I was about 7 or 8 years old. Tiny bit of personal backstory. My great-grandmother's second husband ended up abusing his grandkids, who happened to be my aunts and my father, for over a decade. But it was never discovered or spoken about until after he had passed away, about the same time that I was born. So thankfully, I never met him. But as we all know, that kind of abuse can seriously alter your view of the world around you. In this case, it made my family very hyper-vigilant about protecting me, and I wasn't allowed to be outside alone or sleep at anyone's house ever. Now that that's out of the way, on to the actual story. Since I was born, my grandmother had always lived with us. Before I was school-aged, I stayed home with her during the day, and once I began school, she would watch me whenever we had summer or holiday breaks. I loved her. She was a southern red-haired firecracker who took no crap from anyone, but had the biggest soft spot for me. So this winter break, I had just gotten new rollerblades and was going up and down the paved walkway practicing. My grandma was on the porch reading and watching me, and then the house phone rang. She debated having me come inside while she went to answer it. I pleaded to stay though, as I was finally getting the hang of it. She reluctantly agreed and went inside to answer it, but she left the main door open so that she could still see me through the screen door. It took a few minutes for her to return, but during that time, nothing happened, so I think she was more at ease. She returned to her book, and now I was working on learning a few tricks. After maybe another half hour or so, she said it was time for lunch and that we had to go inside. I absolutely begged her to let me play just a little bit longer, and promised when she finished preparing lunch I would come inside, no questions asked. She stood there watching me for a bit, but then agreed and again went inside, leaving the screen door wide open, and she told me to sing while I skated so that she could hear me. Moments later, maybe 2 or 3, a white van came down the street, very slowly. They seemed lost, but I didn't really pay it much mind because I was just a kid. I was unaware of the evils of the world. Plus, I was on the other side of the chain link fence, so, in my head, I was considered safe. Even when it rolled up and stopped right in front of the house, I kept on skating. It wasn't until the passenger door opened and an extremely tall man stepped out and asked me which way was the highway that I began to get nervous. I held out the gate for stability and pointed in the direction. He tried to make some small chat that I can't really recall, but it was along the lines of, how was my Christmas? What did Santa bring me? Etc. And then he asked if I wanted to have the toys that his daughter didn't want. I was still silent because now I was scared. The way he looked at me, it was dark. He was smiling, but his eyes, they seemed both joyful and vicious at the same time. It still unnerves me to this day. He slowly came closer to the gate and then asked if I wanted to go check out the toy. This is exactly what they taught about stranger danger in school and home, so I shook my head and began to skate backwards towards the door, not wanting to take my eyes off of him, but also not wanting to yell or run, because I didn't want to be rude if he really was just a nice guy after all. He then came closer to the point where he was only a few feet away from the gate and asked if my parents were home. Now all the thoughts of politeness vanished and I panicked. I yelled for my grandma and tried to run inside, which landed me promptly on my back, and I smacked the back of my head against the concrete. At the exact same moment, he unlatched the gate to come inside, and before he could get to me, my grandma came bursting through the door with a cast iron skillet in her hand and cursing at him. He looks up and sees her, and then bolts. He hopped back in the van, and before the door could close properly, the driver was speeding down the street. My grandma then bypassed me completely and ran after the van, now screaming at them. She picked me up and carried me inside, and then called the police and my dad while she asked me what happened. 10 minutes later, I'm with the paramedics and getting my scraped elbows all patched up, while my grandma spoke with the police. My dad showed up soon after, and I didn't go outside for the rest of that break. Years later, in my late teens, it came up one Christmas in conversation, and I got more of the story. Turns out, my grandma was on edge a little bit more than normal because there had been a man who broke into a woman's apartment, and she had actually been assaulted right before Christmas, and the man was still on the loose. The description that my grandma and I both gave the police actually matched the man to a T. Bald spot, bright blue eyes, and well over 6 feet tall. We don't really know if they ever caught him, or them, since I'm sure whoever was driving the van was 100% down with whatever evil plan that man had for me. But thank God for my grandma. I really do believe that she saved my life that day.
A bit of backstory before I begin. This happened in 2007 in upstate New York on Christmas night, around 8:30 p.m. The day was pleasant and festive, opening presents early in the morning with my sisters, hearty breakfast made by Dad, delicious smells from the kitchen as Mom and Dad prepared a feast, visits from extended family bringing pies and cakes for dessert. Around 2, we all sat down to eat, and then lazed about for the rest of the afternoon into the evening. At about 8, after everyone had left and the food was all put away for round 2 the following day, I decided to head over to visit my friend in the next village. The drive would be about 10 minutes if I took the back roads to get there, so I did. First, a little background on where my friend lived. It was a housing development surrounding a private lake. You might call it a gated community. You could still drive through it freely after hours by entering one of 4 private entry points. Since the community was built around the lake, the road surrounding it went in a spiral sort of shape. The houses were sparsely positioned on the outermost part of the spiral road, closest to the 4 private entry points. As you drove in further, there were a lot more houses positioned closer together nearer the lake. My friend lived on the outer edge of this development, so once I reached the entry point, it would only take me another few minutes until I reached the house. His house, along with all the others, were far enough apart that you couldn't see them from the road as you were driving by. There were woods on either side of them, with long driveways and open fields. You could see porch lights in the distance, but that was about it. As I entered into the development, the speed limit dropped from 30 miles per hour down to 20. There were no streetlights in the development, and for some reason, I never put my high beams on. I couldn't go any faster than the speed limit because there were speed bumps in every 30 feet or so. It was a mild night. I remember having my driver's side window open slightly, taking in some fresh air. I remember driving in silence, which was unusual for me. I normally always listen to music when driving. I must have been enjoying the quietness after the commotion of the day. I reached a section of the road that had barren fields on either side and woods set to the back. Houses were probably nestled back into the trees. As I drove, I noticed what looked like someone walking up ahead on the opposite side of the road, coming in my direction. Mind you, I was still going about 20 miles per hour the whole time, so it was probably less than a minute by the time the walker came into clear view. I got a quick scan of it from my windshield before my car, and it was exactly parallel. This is what I saw. It was not a person. It stood on two long legs, with long arms hanging down from its shoulders. It was strong-looking, lean, muscular, but not beefy in stature. It looked thin at the same time. It stood at least 7 feet tall. It was light-colored. I'm not sure whether it was white, tan, yellow, or grayish. It didn't appear to have fur, but there was some texture to the skin. It wasn't smooth. There appeared to be something coming down off of its back. I don't know what it was. All I can recall about its face is the small features it had, but the mouth and jaw were notably large. It had pointed things atop its head. Two things going straight upward with something mingled between the two things. That's what I got from a quick scan, and from my observation of it, as it neared my car and as my car neared it. As my car became parallel to it within a split second, I went from looking out my windshield to looking at it from my driver's side window. At that moment, its face quickly peered down at me, and all I remember was the mouth open wide. Out came a remarkable scream that I'll never forget. It gives me chills just thinking about it. It consisted of a high-pitched shrill shriek, enveloped by a deep guttural growl. Both sounds happened simultaneously in that scream. I kept driving all the while. This was all happening so fast that I didn't even have a chance to be scared or shocked or anything. I continued driving and continued past my friend's house and drove home. I called him to tell him what happened, and I just needed to get back. I was probably running on adrenaline to get home. Later on, I was in total shock after it sunk in. Had my driver's side window been opened fully, it would have touched me, or worse, taken me. I'm certain of it. To this day, I still haven't worked out what this was. Has anyone else ever seen anything like this?
Personally, the last half of 2017 has been pretty exhausting for me. The most draining part, both emotionally, physically, and financially, has been the laborious task of moving my father into an aged care facility due to his rapidly advancing dementia. He lives in Tasmania, where I grew up. I'm currently living and working in Brisbane, which is about 2,500 kilometers to the north of Tasmania. I've been making the 3.5-hour flight down to Tasmania about twice a month to sort out my dad's situation. I've been busying myself by fixing up his empty, dilapidated home in order to get it ready to be sold. I moved out all of his furniture and belongings, save for a pile of blankets and pillows that I turn into a makeshift bed on the floor while I'm in visiting. The house is situated in a semi-rural area, surrounded by overgrown trees and bushes. It's an old house. It's damp, everything creaks, and there's currently no electricity, which makes the night very creepy. The house itself is not very secure. No alarm system. The doors do have locks, but a forceful nudge will pop the door right open. I flew in on Christmas Eve in the late evening, picked up my hire car to make the hour-long drive down to the house. I stopped in at a friend's place who lives about 10 minutes away from my dad's place to have a few beers and shoot the crap about the year that had just passed. After a couple of hours, I realized that I had probably surpassed the legal blood alcohol limit to drive. My friend's legendary wife dropped me off at my dad's and offered to come back in the morning to pick me up and go back to their place to get my car. A true Christmas miracle. I entered my dad's house around midnight. Inside the house was pitch black, and in my slightly drunk state, I flipped the light switch, and nothing happened. Oh yeah, that's right, no power. Using my phone as a light to navigate my way through the house over the creaky floorboards, I noticed that some of the tools that I'd left laying around inside the house had been stolen. I sighed and accepted the fact that it was my own stupid fault for leaving them out in an unsecure house. Some kids probably noticed that no one is living there and took advantage of the situation. It was unsettling knowing that someone had been in here, but I didn't bother calling the police over a hammer, wrench, and screwdriver that came to a grand total of about $16.50. So I wasn't too concerned about it. The good news was the big toolbox, which I kept locked up in the laundry cupboard that houses my more expensive power tools, was still there and intact. I studied the padlock and the space around it, and it looked pretty scratched up and dented, like someone had crudely attempted to pry it open. Nice try, idiots, I said out loud to myself. The toolbox is very big and heavy, way too big for one person to carry it. That is, unless you're Andre the Giant. Exhausted, I went into one of the furnitureless bedrooms and made my makeshift bed out of the blankets and pillows. I couldn't get comfortable, and it was taking me a while to drift off to sleep. As I was laying there, the only sounds that I could hear over the ringing of my tinnitus was the gentle rustle of the wind through the trees. I could also hear what sounded like the unmistakable crunch of boots on the gravel driveway that went up to the side of the house. I tried to listen harder. Then there was a loud gong sound of something solid coming into contact with the metal railing that leads up to the back door. This makes me sit up all wide-eyed, while my heart rate starts to increase. Maybe it was a wallaby or a possum. I just sit there, as still as possible, just listening. I can hear the sound of trees in the wind and nothing else for a few moments, and I start to calm down. This is then interrupted by the pop and squeak of the back door being pushed open. Crap! I freeze, not knowing what to do. I could hear footsteps creaking through the back of the house, and I hear the laundry cupboard being opened. I was up the other end of the hallway, but I could hear whispering. The only words I could make out were, "There, shh, be quick." I pull myself together and pull out my phone and call the police. I chat to the dispatcher while burying my head under the pillow to muffle my voice. I explain the situation to the dispatcher, and she tells me that the police are on their way. While this is happening, I can hear a chink sound of what I'm assuming was the lock of the toolbox trying to be broken. The dispatcher suggests that I lock the door of the room I'm in. I agree, and as I slowly pad over across the room to the door, one of the floorboards then creaks so freaking loudly. I freeze, and I hear dead silence from the laundry. Crap. They must have heard. After about 30 seconds of standing still, I try to take another step and get yet another high-pitched creak. But this seems to work in my favor because I can hear my new house guests scatter away out the back door. I lock the bedroom door and tell the dispatcher that I think they're gone now. She tells me to stay put until the police arrive, and I then tell her I'm more than happy to comply. After about 5 minutes, the cops arrive and the dispatcher then bids me farewell. The police did a search of the area and they didn't find anything, as expected. They had tried to break open the toolbox. One of the cops says, "Why didn't they just use bolt cutters? Freaking amateurs." And we kind of all have a little laugh about it. I explained to the police about how when I came home, some of the tools that I left laying around were stolen, and that the toolbox looked like it had already been attempted to be broken into. Upon hearing that, the other cop stated his theory of how events took place. They probably broke in earlier tonight before you got here. They grabbed what they could, tried to open the toolbox but couldn't, and then left to go get something to open it with. While they were gone, you came home, and then they arrived back here to open the toolbox. I doubt they were dangerous, probably just kids, but who knows. Good timing, I think to myself. I then make a report, and that's that. I stayed up until sunrise, and then decided to get a couple of hours of sleep until my friend's wife could come pick me up to collect my car. I also ask if I can keep my tools at their place for safekeeping, to which they agree. I drove down to my dad's nursing home and had Christmas lunch with him and his new elderly buddies. The following day, I decided to go to a hardware store and purchase some newer, sturdier door locks. Hopefully this kind of thing doesn't happen ever again. and especially around Christmas. Hey everyone, thank you for taking the time to listen to today's video. I really hope you enjoyed it. If you have your own personal scary story or experience, be sure to submit them to my website at southerncannibal.com. Stay safe everyone, and remember to always stay hungry.